Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Hannah Yu, Curator of Public Programs at the Fowler Museum at UCLA. The Fowler is celebrating Earth Day with Cahuilla artist Gerald Clarke Jr., featured in the exhibition Fire Kinship, Southern California Native Ecology and Art. He will discuss traditional ecological knowledge as the foundation for an Indigenous understanding of the world, our relationship to fire, and his artistic practice. Gerald Clarke Jr. is a visual artist, educator, tribal leader, and cultural practitioner whose family has lived in the Anza Valley since time immemorial. An enrolled citizen of the Cahuilla Band of Indians, Clarke lives in the home built by his grandfather on the Cahuilla Indian Reservation and oversees the Clarke family cattle ranch. He is a professor of ethnic studies at the University of California, Riverside, where he teaches classes in Native American art, history, and culture, and is the special advisor to the Chancellor on Native American relations. As a visual artist, he has exhibited extensively, and his work can be seen in numerous shows and major museum collections. If you have any questions during the program, please submit them through the Q&A function found at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can submit and upvote entries that you would like to be considered to be answered by the artist during the program. And now over to you, Gerald.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hannah. Good afternoon, everyone. Super happy to be here and be able to share with you some of my thoughts about traditional ecological practices. Hopefully, everyone can see my opening slide there. And I wish that we could all here in California could look out over the landscape and see the product of thousands of years of ecological management by native people. But because of a couple centuries now of native people being prohibited from practicing our traditional culture and our ecological ways, I think it's kind of hard to recognize how deeply involved Native people were with the landscape here in California and in the local ecologies. Someone who could tell us who did see it and experience this would have been the early explorers who came to California and who witnessed firsthand what the land seemed like here in California. And you don't have to take my word for it. They did a good job of documenting what they saw and what they experienced. And so in early testimony here we have Sir Francis Drake, who sailed up and down the coast of California here. And there you see that the quote at the bottom of the slide there. Infinite was the company of very large and fat deer, which there we saw by the thousands, and we supposed in a herd. And so we do have to keep in mind that many of these early explorers, writing these down in their journals and sending letters back to Europe, they did tend to kind of oversell what they were seeing. But the evidence is clear that much of what they were seeing was indeed a fact and what they were experiencing. So we have testimony by these early explorers about the richness of the land, the health of the animals and the plants and the people themselves. You don't come across entries in these journals where they're talking about these poor, emaciated native people. In fact, the opposite was true. They were many times mentioned of how hardy and how vibrant these communities were that were living within, right, these lands and different microclimates here in California. This is from the Portola expedition, known as 1769. Juan Crespi was a Franciscan missionary who accompanied the Portola expedition up into California. And again, they're very specific in their journals. So look at that, Tuesday, July 18th, 1769, near the San Luis Rey River, just north of present-day San Diego, so northern San Diego County. That's very specific. And he goes on to talk about what they're seeing as they're traveling up through Southern California. And I would just point out there that we have to understand as well that their positionality, what they were seeing, the only vocabulary they had, the only way to understand it was through what they were familiar with, right, through their travels or back home in Europe. And so their positionality was very much molded into a certain worldview. But I would point out there that last sentence, the valley is all green with good grass and has many wild grapes, and one sees some spots that resemble vineyards. And so, when they come to California, they see this land that seems to be almost park-like, like manicured or what have you. And let's see, it goes on to create this kind of idea, right, of the pristine wilderness, what I call a myth. And so these early explorers, think about how far they had traveled, right, and the dangers they experienced coming, halfway across the globe. And so when they saw this land, again, through their own positionality, they equated it almost like the Garden of Eden. And it certainly was like a garden. In my classes, I talk about how the whole state was really a farm or a garden, right? And so it perpetuates this idea, right, that this land is almost like a gift from God to them for risking their lives, for bringing Christianity and civilization to the Western Hemisphere. And in a lot of ways, yes, it was like the Garden of Eden. The only thing they were missing was they didn't understand who the gardeners were. And the gardeners were really the native people here in California. So, this pristine wilderness myth that I call it, what they were actually witnessing, right, was a landscape with centuries of careful ecological management practices, right, that involved the coppicing, the pruning, the harrowing, sowing, weeding, burning, right, one of our topics today, digging, thinning, and selective harvesting of plants to maximize each species' productivity, usefulness, and this kind of idea, right? This contribution of this interconnected interests that made up the ecological system of plants, animals, climate, weather patterns, soil, and humans. And I just want to point out those two words there. So burning, because that's what we're talking about, the use of fire, but also this idea of interconnectedness. And when the explorers came here, the native people here were viewed upon as being primitive, right? And really, when the more you learn about traditional ecological practices of the native people, one of the things you find is the only thing that's primitive, right, was this European understanding of what these native people were doing. And it wasn't just here in California. I found this quote from an English person. I think this was over on the East Coast, but look at that date, 1737. And in a written document, it says that native use flints to set fire of the country in all places where they come. So this was something that was practiced throughout, probably globally, right? But particularly here in the Western Hemisphere and by native people here in California. And so these practices, these ecological practices that I'm talking about, have been given the name traditional ecological knowledge. I call it TEK. Some people call it tech, but I don't like to use tech because I don't want people mistaking it with TECH, right, with technology. And this is a technology, but it's a little bit, I think, it's a very human technology, right? So, traditional ecological knowledge, it refers to ecological management practices formed over generations and based on observation, experimentation, and long-term relationships with plants, animals, climate, and environment. Okay. And if you think about observation, experimentation, long-term relationships, sounds an awful lot like the scientific theory, right? And indeed, if you think about America today and West Western European culture here now in America, we are not good, and nor do we really prize these long-term relationships. And so this is an understanding of the world that's handed down generation to generation for thousands of generations of understanding, right, how the world works and this interconnectedness of all things. And I would point out here that these practices of pruning, of gathering, right? Uh, these weren't just practices to help people, right? But again, with this understanding of the interconnectedness of all things, right? That it was part of a whole system that benefited not only humans, but it benefited the plant life. It benefited the animal life. And so oftentimes, and you see there in the orange, that some of the practices that the native people here practiced was to actually plant shrubs and grasses which were completely inedible to human beings. Sometimes those plants were helpful in terms of basket making or the making of material cultural items, right? But it was also part of human existence, I would say, in terms of a source of protein in the terms of hunting wild game. So the promotion of these grasslands not only provided seeds for human consumption or even plant material fibers, right, for basketry or what have you, but it also provided like food for wildlife, for quail, rabbit, deer, antelope, and elk. And so this provided a food supply for these animals, and the animals provided a food supply for the human beings. So there's that kind of connectedness that I've been talking about. Now, in my introduction, you heard Hannah say that I run my family's cattle ranch, and it's something I really enjoy, and it forces me really to pay attention to the seasons, pay attention to the rainfall and all these things that you have to understand in order to be successful in doing that. And so, when you picture a farm, right? Oftentimes you picture, say, a red barn, maybe there's a tractor there, but we often picture a garden with like rows of crops, right? Lettuce and tomatoes and onions or what have you, right? And then we also picture like um, fences, right, with paddocks or pastures where you would have animals, cows, pigs, sheep, that kind of thing, right? And so when the Europeans came here, they didn't see that. They didn't see that in the lands here, Cahuilla, and practiced by the local people. What they did see was just this what they considered this kind of wild landscape. But here's the thing: as a hunting and gathering people, right? When you go hunting or fishing, you're not always successful, right? Especially these days. But these people knew where the animals would be when they went hunting. How did they know? Because they had planted the fields for the animals to provide their food source, you see? So it was a really kind of advanced system of agriculture, I think. And, until lately, right, anthropology has kind of looked down upon hunter-gatherer societies, right, in favor of settled cultures that had writing, right, and that had large-scale architecture or what have you. California is really an amazing place, and from where I'm talking to you today from my office at UC Riverside, in hour and a half, depending on traffic, I could be at the ocean, right? 45 minutes I could be in the desert, and another 45 minutes I could be up in the mountains. I mean, this is, California. The geography of California is so varied that the geography of California was really more conducive to multiple smaller settlements. And oftentimes, these settlements are called tribes, right, or tribelets. For me, I just refer to tribal communities, and the geography of California was more conducive to that. And so we often tend to look down, right, upon hunter-gatherer societies. But in this case, in the geography and the ecologies here in California, it was much more successful way of living sustainably on the land by being a hunter-gatherer society. My people, the Cahuilla people, in February, we might start harvesting agave at lower elevations. And then as you go into March and April, you could follow the agave as it ripens and matures for harvest, and you would follow that up the mountain to 3,000 to 4,000 feet, right? And then you would switch over to the yucca, and the yucca would start. And actually, right now, the harvesting of the yucca blossoms, I'll be doing that actually tomorrow. And you could follow it on up, right up through summer, depending on what elevation you're at. And again, the planting of these plants you knew where the wild game were. And they say, you can see the photo there of the acorn. They say at the time of contact, 70% of California Indians ate acorn on a daily basis. It was something that was gathered in the fall, right around the time of the Santa Ana winds. And so the acorns would ripen, right? And they would take poles and they could hit the branches of the oak trees. The black oak was what was preferable. But also you had the help from the wind. So climate was involved with this as well. And the acorns could be stored and then used throughout the year. And acorn, high in protein, high in fiber, and high in fat. And while fat has kind of been vilified in a contemporary diet, you have to understand that the wild game that was eaten by these people was very low in fat. So the acorn combined with wild game as another protein was almost like a perfect diet. And so these practices of how to do this, right? Um, how to address, right, the needs of the community without damaging, right, the earth or the plant life. How to live sustainably is something that's been handed down, right, from older generations to younger generations. And so, a wonderful book there, Tending the Wild by Kat Anderson, and a knowledge built on history gained through many generations of learning passed down by elders with practical as well as spiritual practices. Now, I got to tell you, again, teaching at UC Riverside, I'm teaching a class called California Native Cultures, and one of the first things I ask my students are point north. And I have them close their eyes, and they all point in a direction. And then when they open their eyes, one thing you see is these people are all pointing all different directions. And I explained to them that, had I asked that question 500 years ago, everyone would have got it, right? And so we've lost just as much knowledge, and in some cases, very practical knowledge. And then what we've gained, right, without our cell phones and electricity, might not be very useful to us. But you got to understand that fire was also part of these practices. And so here's just a few of the California plants that actually need fire in order to propagate and to flourish. So there's the manzanita and the lilac, the giant sequoia, the chamise, scrub oak, and even poppies. All those plants in different ways require fire. And I remember an elder telling me that that's how the people cleaned the forest. That's how it was seen. It was clean the forest. It was a way of returning a lot of minerals and things back into the soil by doing control burns. Now, it's important to understand, especially after the tragic fires that took place in LA earlier this year, that's not the kind of fire we're talking about. The fires we have today are so intense, and it's because of the buildup of fuels, right, and the drying out of the climate that have made those fires much more extreme. What we're talking about historically are the types of fires that would be burned occasionally, right? Every couple of years, these areas would be burned. So you didn't have that big buildup of dry fuels that, have impacted the fires that we have today. Now, there's one really important thing that I want you to understand about TEK, or traditional ecological knowledge, is that it's a lifestyle custom designed and entirely sustainable for a specific environment. Now, what do I mean by that? It's tailored for specific lands, for specific climate and microclimates, right? So, like what the Cahuilla did here in South Central California would not work at all for the Hoopa in Northern California. It wouldn't work for the Zuni in New Mexico, nor would it work for the Inuit in the Arctic. Those are very, very different environments, right? And I think this is where I think contemporary environmental policy kind of gets lost because we do these sweeping national right policies or plans right without truly acknowledging how diverse the landscape is. Traditional ecological knowledge is designed for a very specific place, right? And not simply just like these blanket rules, okay? I see a question about how is yucca plant flower used for tea. Okay, so the blossoms. So yucca is just an amazing plant, and it's maturing as we speak. So this month and into May, and the stalk shoots up at around 7 to 9 years when the plant matures. And if you can cut that stalk off before it flowers, and you can actually eat the stalk, and it's really one of my favorite things. It's I eat it raw, and it's kind of a cross between like a celery and an apple. You can also bake it and then and use the pulp inside. And we've actually made breads and things with it. Um, but I don't. I only take like maybe one stalk a year because when you take a stalk, then that plant doesn't seed. It doesn't create seed and then propagate itself. So you only take a stalk whenever you know it's in an area where there are a lot of yuccas already. Once it flowers, you can actually pick the flowers. And my daughters and we go up into the San Jacinto Mountains, and you know, I've taught them to take about a quarter of the blossoms off of each plant. That way, the 75% of the flowers can be pollinated and then make seed, and that's what propagates. That's a sustainable way of gathering them. And then I parboil the blossoms and saute them in some olive oil. It's kind of a modern fusion thing, but I saute them in some olive oil, maybe some garlic and some onion. And it tastes kind of like a floral cabbage, and it's one of traditional foods for my tribe. So again, it's important to remember that TEK is custom designed for specific environments, and you can't just use it anywhere, right? It's custom designed for a specific spot. Now, another thing I do with my students, I ask them to define nature. And sometimes that's really tough because it's like all encompassing, right? It's everything. But I think this how we define the concept of nature has led to really this basis for misunderstanding between native people and non-native people. And oftentimes, this European, Western European, and then brought over here right into the United States, this idea of nature is this kind of combination, right, of climate and environment and the plant life and the animal life. Okay. And we could, usually a student will say, well, what about microbes? And yeah, we'll include that in there as well, right? And I'm not sure if you see something that's kind of missing too. And can you see I've recycled the recycle symbol here, but the thing that's missing in this diagram is people, right? And so, and I apologize, that's a real binary kind of symbol, but that was just something easy I could grab to put into the slide here. But you know, we are part of the environment, right? We are here on this earth and we're part of this system, okay? But unfortunately, and you could even trace it back to the Greeks and the Romans and even early Christian religion, right, is that this kind of separation of humans from the earth itself. And oftentimes, you see it in the language, right? So we talk about the forces of nature, right? And this Western European idea, right, of nature almost being like an adversarial relationship with human beings, okay? And again, you don't have to take my word for it. Just look at literature. Think about books like Moby Dick. Think about The Call of the Wild, right? Overcoming nature. Here's The Revenant, and it's also a movie. And if you've seen the movie, It says a novel of revenge, right? But nature is very much a part of this, and I know both the book and the movie are quite brutal in their treatment and their views of nature. There's Old Man in the Sea, right, and then more to our own times into the wild. And so this shows us these themes that we see in contemporary society, where oftentimes we see ourselves outside of nature, and when we look at nature, either we see it as kind of this adversarial kind of position, or we see it simply as natural resources. Now, I'm really happy that here at UCR, and I see this in other institutions, that we are in the process of moving away from this concept of natural resources, and we're moving towards, like here at UCR, sustainability studies. And I like that very much. But I think this idea of seeing the world around us, the natural world around us, as a resource simply to be used, right, in order to build wealth. Here in California, it was gold, it was timber, right? And I think that's part of the reason why fire has been vilified, because fire is seen as simply a destructive element, and not simply as part of the whole system that has a vital role to play, right, in propagating plants and the local ecology. Now, so moving on to an indigenous idea of nature, you might think it looks like this. And actually, I would say no, I don't think this is an indigenous idea of nature. And do you know why? Because I just want to point out here, look at how people in the symbol there, notice I've put them right in the middle and everything's just like around us, right? And that's that kind of Western ego, I think, to think that, oftentimes, even people who claim to love nature, oftentimes they see it as their own kind of playground or what have you. My students ask me too about, like, do I go out hunting, or where do I gather my acorn, things like that. And I don't, where I gather acorn is actually national forest land, and I have to get a permit that allows me to do that. But I don't just go to there and gather acorn. And oftentimes students will tell me that they heard that there's no such thing as land ownership for Native people, and I don't think I'm always wary of blanket statements like that, because I'm sure you could find the exception to that. And indeed, Native people often had gathering areas that each different community would claim or what have you. But I think a better way of looking at land ownership for Native people is that the land owns us. And along with that relationship is that there's a human obligation and responsibility back to the land. Okay. So where I go to gather my acorn, I don't just go in the fall and gather acorn. I actually go in the spring, and I'll probably be going sometime this month, now that it's starting to warm up. And usually I go and I take trash bags, because a lot of city people will go up into the mountains there dirt when the snow is on, and I end up picking up broken sleds, beer bottles, and dirty diapers. And it's because I have an obligation to those lands. It's a different relationship than simply ownership. So I think maybe this is a better concept of an indigenous idea of nature, which is that we have obligations and responsibility to the climate and to the environment. We have responsibility to the plant life, and we have responsibilities to the animal life. And that responsibility is, you live up to that by practicing these traditional ecological practices. Now, for my own people, the Cahuilla people, our idea of nature, and this is according to anthropologist Lowell Bean, who has studied and lived with the Cahuilla alongside the Cahuilla all the way up, and I think he was 90 or in his 90s when he passed not too long ago. And he's described with the Cahuilla this idea of a reciprocal obligation. And this stems from this belief that humans were only a part of that larger interactive system composed of cooperating entities that shared responsibility in the workings of the universe. So that tells me it's not just about us, right? But we are part of this world. We are one of the cogs that makes this system work, right? And so we have that obligation and responsibility to be a part of it and to do our part. And historically, one of those things we did was we burned the landscape. And you might be surprised. I had asked you earlier to think about your own definition of what how would you define nature, right? You might be surprised to find that there actually is no Cahuilla word for nature. In fact, many native cultures or indigenous cultures have no word for nature. Now, I think that kind of boggles people's minds, right? And there's no nature, there's no concept of nature. And the answer, I think, is actually pretty revealing, I think. So, in child development, you you when you're learning words, okay, and say 2, 3 years old, and you learn the word chair, you can point to a chair and say, that's a chair, right? Not only have you learned that word, one of the main things you've learned is that that object, that chair, is outside of yourself, right? So for these native people, they've never seen that nature is outside of ourselves. Remember, interconnectedness. So we are part of that system. And I think that is just a deeply held belief that, again, your positionality, how you view the world, how you interact with the world, you see things, right, as relatives. And indeed, when you look at traditional stories by various tribes, they talk about their animal relatives, they talk about their plant relatives. You see, there's that connection, there's that long-term relationship, right, and connection. And it's not outside of ourselves. We're all part of one ecosystem, one family here on the earth. So this reciprocal obligation, right, are these beliefs, right, that basically were protocols for how you interact with the world. Okay, so these actions combined with performance of appropriate ceremonies, rituals, ensured that the universe would remain in balance and that humans, along with other entities, could continue to sustain life. So these practices, um, they weren't entirely selfless, right? But the people knew you take care of the land takes care of you. That's that reciprocity. You take care of the animals, and they take care of you. It was these agreements basically that the people reached in how they interacted with the world. Ironically, this led to this misunderstanding, this not fully grasping these major differences between this Christian European worldview and this indigenous worldview, right, were led to the formation of these stereotypes. So one of these stereotypes was lazy Indians. And where that comes from is that the early California settlers, they would see the native people go out in the mornings and gather acorn to do a little hunting, fishing, right? Gather edible plants or whatever. Then they would come back to the community and they would eat, they would sing songs, they would tell stories, they would relax. And in the settler's mind, well, wait a minute, there's more out there to get. Why don't you go get it all? Right. And the reason why they didn't was because they understood you don't take it all, right? You have a responsibility, an obligation to leave some for the other beings, right? And so this very positive thing ends up being seen as a very negative thing. They saw the Indians were lazy, right? Too lazy to go out and work hard, right, and make their wealth. That wasn't our way. Also, this kind of like spiritual one with nature. Those of you who are older like me, we remember Iron Eyes Cody in the commercials, him standing on the side of the road, crying about the litter or what have you. And uh, these are all stereotypes, right? And it's not that Native people weren't spiritual. It's not that we didn't respect the land, right, and all that. But those stereotypes just they're based in misunderstanding, not on actual interactions and from an indigenous worldview. And so what I say is that these practices, traditional ecological practices that I'm talking about, they're all part of something that I call the indigenous intellectual tradition. And so you might say to yourself, well, a stereotype like Indians are spiritual, right, or intuitive, one with nature, they respect nature. You might say that those are positive stereotypes. But ultimately, what they've done is they've robbed us. They've robbed Native people of our intellectual traditions. And again, the more you learn about traditional ecological knowledge, you can equate that with um, the scientific method through observation, experimentation over generations. Okay, and so when I present this idea of indigenous intellectual traditions to my students, many of them have never seen those words put together. They've heard of indigenous traditions, right? Maybe intellectual traditions, but not the three together. And that's exactly what we're looking at. That's what we're learning today. And the fact of the matter is that Indian people have been seen as being simple-minded and intuitive, animal-like even, right? And the only thing primitive about Native people are the outsiders kind of perspective of us. And to help kind of humanize some of what I'm saying here today, uh, I want to include a quote. This is a good friend of mine, Lori Sisquak. She runs the Clarke Cultural Center at Sherman Indian School here in Riverside. So, one of the federal boarding schools that was established in the late 19th century here in Riverside. This is where my grandparents met. And she believes that the environment is set up to be used. And she actually feels bad about allowing plants to go unpicked because the plants will feel uncared for. Isn't that a very different perspective than maybe what you thought it might be, right? And indeed, I had mentioned that when I go into the forest, I get a gathering permit. That way I don't get hassled by, rangers or what have you. But it took us a decade to get these gathering permits okayed through the National Forest Service. And why is that? It's because they could only imagine Native people, if Native people are given the opportunity to go into the forest and take things, the only thing they could imagine was we would take all of it, right? And then we would rape the land and there would be nothing left. And that perspective, right, we had to overcome that perspective because they didn't understand how we view the world, how we view the earth, and this idea of reciprocity, right? And so this idea of feeling bad, right? And some of you probably think, well, harvesting from the land, right, foraging or what have you, that damages the plants. But that's not necessarily true. When it's done intelligently, it actually helps those plants produce more fruit, to produce more seed, to produce more growth. Okay. But it had to be done in very specific manner and timing, right? So I will say that the women of the tribal communities were the most knowledgeable in terms of the plants and were often the leaders when it came to plant gathering. And so our basket making traditions here in California, which are just some of the world's best baskets in the world, made right here in California, and it was the women. And so they were artisans, but they were also like botanists. They understood the plants that they used. They understood how they grew, where they grew, and what they needed, when to harvest, when not to harvest. Even just last week, I was on my way to school, and Juncus is one of the major basket plants that's used by the Cahuilla people. And actually, my tribe was doing a cultural burn just last week, burning off parts of the area because the basket weavers want it to be burned down to come back to create healthier, stronger plants that would then in turn help them make their baskets. So she remembers, going back to this slide, she remembers hearing of a tribe whose word for an oak grove translated into "they wait for us." So there's really what she's saying there is it's really talking about it's a relationship. It's not just a one-way relationship, right? That would be an unhealthy relationship. It's about working, right? And this idea of reciprocity. She goes on to stress the importance of gathering to us as human beings. So, when gathering, it's important to pray, be thankful, and be respectful. And she says, we need this. Healing the earth is healing ourselves. If you take anything else away from this lecture on here on Earth Day, healing the earth is healing ourselves because everything is connected, it's not divided. Our language, our spirituality, our survival, our stories, it's all connected. And indeed, here at UC Riverside, there are a lot of very smart people um, in various departments around this campus here, and they've all focused on certain areas, right, of our world, of our existence. And what Lori is saying here is, and what I'd like to see is more of these departments coming together and combining their knowledge for this more holistic approach to the world around us. Okay, so going back, so I've been talking a lot about this, traditional ecological knowledge, what I call TEK, and let's talk a bit about the exhibit because, when I was approached by the curators to contribute to the exhibition, I assumed a lot of the other artists would be looking at the use of fire in terms of what I've been talking about, of control burns, about burning to make, to increase plant life, to assist in the health of the plant life, the animal life, or what have you. And so, here we have an image from the show, and you can see the Thule canoe or boat there on the right, and then the dugout there on the left, and some other images there. And so that's one way, right, that fire was used as a way of cleaning the forest, of improving the health of the forest, and then the products of that being used, right, to create material culture, things like that. In Liamata Fragua's installation here of the poppies, I hope everyone got to see this and enjoy this view. And if you remember, the poppies were on my list of plants that actually that follow fires, and their seeds are activated by fire. And so this beautiful installation, there again, we're talking about how fire um, has benefited the landscape. And I've seen people describe some of the hillsides in the spring when you're driving around California and you see these poppies that are all in blossom, right, in bloom over the hills, and how the hills themselves almost seem as though they're on fire. And then going on to the paintings in the Wishoyo Alvitri's paintings in the exhibition, and really wonderful paintings that you see here, and the kind of poppy colors and then the shapes in the background, but then these native women and their portraits within the picture plane. And again, going back to the idea, it was really women who had a lot of the plant knowledge and understood, right? Uh, uh, Spiritually and ecologically, right? What the land provided, what the plants provided, and it's important to acknowledge the role of women in doing that. And I think Washoyo did that, and I think for those of you who don't know, my daughter is Emily Clarke, who is a poet and contributed this poem to the exhibition, which "Woman Fire" is the title of the poem. But I see it is doing very much of acknowledging what Wishoyo was doing in the paintings of connecting, the role of women within the community, within these practices of traditional ecological knowledge and the uses of fire, both, in the application of fire to the land, but also the spiritual aspects of it, our connection to fire and warmth, right, and protection. Uh, and then yet again, we have another version here. This was the image that shows us playing our traditional gambling game here in Southern California. We call peon, and oftentimes it's played at night. Teams sit on either side of a fire and sing these songs, and there's wagers that are being made and game pieces that are being hidden, but fire being central to that. And so when I was asked to participate in the exhibition, I wanted to take on a more spiritual approach to fire, and so this was my contribution to the exhibition. And I was really thinking about our creation story when I made this piece. And one of the things I'm going to switch up here and start talking, like an artist. But I think all of you understand, you know what traditional, sorry, what cultural appropriation is, right? And it's taking from some other culture, right, without acknowledging, it or what have you. And to be honest with you, I'm very concerned about cultural appropriation by not appropriating from my own tribe, right? And so oftentimes I question whether I should put this out there or not, whatever I happen, the idea is. And so this is probably this as close as I've come to actually doing a depiction of the creation story. But I feel like I left it kind of poetic enough and kind of distant enough where maybe it's not just kind of giving the story away or what have you. But so I have this kind of what I thought of as like a primordial kind of fire going back to the creation, right? We had a pretty good earthquake here. What was it, a couple weeks ago? And my elder, he told me that his elder told him that yeah, of course the earth is alive, right? Everything that's alive has to move a little bit, has to breathe, right? And so when we have earthquakes in the Cahuilla, we do sing songs with gourd rattles about earthquakes. That's part of our world. And so I have the gourd rattles there in the different colors, and then this kind of fire in the center that's kind of spinning. I was thinking about time, and then the central figure of this human heart that was supposed to be kind of like the spark of life, right? And this burning of fire. And the title of the piece actually comes from this book, The Heart is Fire, from Deborah Dozier. This came out, I believe it was published in the 90s. And you see the description there, five Cahuilla elders, Catherine Sobel, Alvino Siva, Dolores Alvarez, Anthony Andreas, and Jomi Modesto come together to tell their own stories, share memories of the old days, and express their thoughts about the future of their much beloved Cahuilla culture. Four of those five are my relatives. And so when I was approached by the curators to do this piece, I immediately thought of this book, and there on the cover, that's Alvino Siva, who was the elder that I learned from. And you see his red rattle. And so I love this photo of the piece because that red rattle is right up front. But this is how I was trying to kind of challenge, myself and what I'm, how do I navigate, right, these beliefs, and how do I put it in physical form? And just a small snippet from our creation story. Mukut is our creator, by the way, and his brother is Mukut Temiawit. And so it says there, Mukut created first tobacco. Before creating humans, before creating the world, tobacco, sacred herb, right? And Mukatami Yowit invented the pipe and gave it two names, man and woman. This pipe they filled with the tobacco, not having light of fire or anything of that kind. They drew on the pipe with their mouths, and fire and smoke came into it. So before there was human beings, before there was the earth itself, the animals, the sun, all that, there was fire, right? And it came from the creator. So those are the things that I was thinking about when I did my work for the show. And then I got to thinking for today's talk, I got to thinking about fire in the studio. And so this is in the studio when I did just that central part. And this is just like um, a test I was doing in the studio. You see my studio there, and there's some prints in the background hanging or what have you. But I was looking, trying to get this sense of the spark of life, right? This burning, maybe even desire to be, right, in the heart itself. And then some of you may be familiar too with I do larger sculptures, basket sculptures, or what have you. And so, how do I make those? Well, I actually, I weld these kind of things up. And so, out of high school, I wasn't encouraged to go to college. I actually was encouraged to do a trade. And so I went to welding school, and that's been really valuable to me in the production of my art. And then here lately, and you can see some prints in the back of the image there on the left, but in the center, I've been, because I run my family's cattle ranch, I started making art based on that experience. So I started welding up branding irons with words and images, and then I heat them up red hot. And so that's what you see there in the middle picture is I'm actually branding wet watercolor paper. It's what I call prints. They're kind of like one of a kind prints where I burn words or images into the paper. So fire is even part of, it's part of my studio practice in a lot of different ways. And even my home, I have an old wood stove that I live in an 85-year-old house my grandpa built, and that's how I heat up my house in the winter. So with that, that's what I have for you today. And in the Cahuilla language, we say "Achima pe'ipa chamkal," which is it was good. It was good that we were gathered here today. It was good that we had this time together. I really appreciate you being here. I was happy to, especially for Earth Day 2025. I think the goal is now to make it Earth Week, and then Earth Month, and then Earth Year, and then Earth Decade. That's what we need. But certainly having a day is certainly a good start to the process. I do see some questions. Hannah, you want me to answer these questions or?
Sure. I think Natalie brought up an interesting question, especially since she's new in LA. And she was asking, is it possible that the fire that happened this year somehow impacted in a symbiotic way the production of blossoming for the spring?
You know, so when things burn, right, like in ceramics, you can actually take when you fire ceramics in a kiln and you instead of using propane or natural gas, you use wood. A lot of times the wood that you burn to heat up the oven, the kiln, a lot of times ashes will actually blow from the firebox and actually land on the pots and melt and form a glass. And it's because the minerals and the things in the earth go up into the tree, and then when they burn, right, those minerals are still there, right? They're non-organic, and so when you have fire like this, a lot of these minerals and these things go back into the earth. So it could, but like I said earlier, that the fires we have today, there's so much fuel and they burn so hot that there are times when it actually sanitizes the land. And so it burns up all the microbes that many of the plants and microorganisms, right, are burned up. And so it may take time for today's fires, right, for the land, right, to recover.
Um, there is a follow-up question from Natalie. How can we reintroduce traditional ecological knowledge in schools, but also in creative places where decisions are made? Because as much as we need technology and science, we do need our traditional knowledge.
Well, thank you for that, Natalie. Because what frustrates me as a native person, but then also as a college professor, is that I see answers in traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples that continues to be dismissed as myth, as legend, as folk tale, right? And there's some answers there, and I think combined with contemporary technology, I think that we could solve a lot of these problems. So I think I'm doing my part. I'm teaching the young people here at UCR. Hopefully, they'll go on and teach others, and that's one way to get that ball started is to get these kinds of things incorporated into public school systems.
Thank you for that, Gerald. There is a question from Emily Clark. How can we continue to celebrate Earth Day throughout the year with traditional ecological knowledge in mind?
You know, I will tell you that I recycle, right? And it feels good. It feels good to me. In some ways it's kind of selfish, but I do it because it makes me feel good that I'm not simply taking away. And I have solar on my house. I drive an electric car that I charge with my solar, right? And so I think it's just a matter of understanding that concept that I mentioned earlier, the obligation and responsibility, right? That we have to live up to that. It's not, we've been into the system now for a couple hundred years where it's just take, take, take. And at some point, it's going to take back, right? In the form of these large fires, in the form of these big hurricanes and tornadoes and stuff. And so I think it's just a matter of living, understanding, right, that responsibility. And that would go back to, I think, Natalie's earlier question, that importance, right, of teaching kids about the responsibility, obligations we have back to the earth.
Thank you. We have one last question from Bobby Tigerman. Can you tell us about your current work as it relates to fire or broader nature themes?
Well, I've always been a bit of a strange artist in that I'm always experimenting, doing new things. As soon as I get comfortable with one thing, I quit doing it, and I like to challenge myself and keep evolving. And so here lately, one of the things I've been challenging are preconceived ideas of what American history is. And so I've been making these fake roadside historic monuments with my own version of history, where, like if you travel around California, you'll see a historic monument that says, this is the first schoolhouse in California. And while that might be true in terms of like the 1700s or something, what are the connotations of that? The connotations are that there was no education here before the Europeans showed up. And that's just completely false, right? And so, like, I did one monument that reminded people, right, that, about TEK. I've actually done one of these about TEK to try to teach people and to get them to question what they think they know about American history. American history didn't start with the 13 colonies. It didn't start with the Declaration of Independence. American history through Native people started thousands of years ago.
Thank you so much, Gerald. Thank you for sharing your knowledge about how traditional ecological knowledge serves as a foundation for an Indigenous understanding of the world, our relationship to fire, and your artistic practice. This concludes our program. We've received some really amazing questions, and I hope we'll be able to continue these conversations for upcoming programs, and also if you have the time to visit the Fowler Museum. Thank you to all who participated. We're so glad that you could all join us virtually for this talk. If you enjoyed today's Lunch and Learn and curious to learn and see more, please come visit us at the Fowler Museum at UCLA and consider becoming a Fowler member. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter and follow us on social media to stay up to date with upcoming exhibitions and programs. Today's program has been recorded and will be uploaded to the Fowler website for you to revisit and share in a few weeks. Have a wonderful week, and we hope to see you at one of our upcoming spring programs. Thank you again, Gerald.
Yeah, happy Earth Day.
Happy Earth Day.